Alla Tulia Meldonia Ahara Mariese, and welcome, dear friends, to Tolkien Untangled. My name is Rainbow Dave, and this is our fourth and final episode discussing the beginning of days and Tolkien's earliest history of Arda. Now, I would definitely recommend watching the previous videos if you haven't already, because in this episode, we're going to pick up right from where I left off in the last video, and continue the story of the first ever elves. So, last time we saw them awake in the land of Cuivienen, and we saw how many were captured and tortured into orcs by the Dark Lord Melkor. So, for the sake of these new elves, the Valar, the gods of Arda, they've decided they have no choice but to go to war once again with the Dark Lord. And their climactic battle in this war is the Battle of the Powers, where Melkor is eventually overthrown by the combined might of the host of the West. And he is captured and chained and brought to the West, to Valinor, to suffer the consequences of his actions. And these consequences are a very, very long imprisonment inside the inescapable halls of Mandos. And so that is where Melkor is as we pick up in this episode. And this is good news. This means, for the first time since the destruction of the lamps, there is genuine peace throughout all of Arda. The Dark Lord is locked away. But the Battle of the Powers was incredibly destructive, and much of Middle-earth now lies in ruins. So, the Valar have a very fateful decision that they need to make. Now, there's a little bit of controversy here amongst the Valar, because not all of them agree. You see, Ulmo, who is the Lord of Waters, he reckons that the elves should be just allowed to live in Middle-earth and to do whatever they want beneath the stars. He doesn't really see any need to interfere with their fate, but the other Valar disagree. You see, Tolkien tells us that the elves are so fair and beautiful that many of the Valar almost fell in love with them, and they actually desired their fellowship, which is kind of nuts to think about. Like, the gods, the fairest beings ever, choose to hang out with the elves? That is a hell of a compliment. But Tolkien does actually say that in the beginning, the elves were stronger and greater than they have since become. Although, it's interesting because he does then go on to say that they have not grown less fair. In fact, although the beauty of the elves in the days of their youth was still beyond any other beauty anywhere else in Eru Ilúvatar's creation, the elves actually get more fair as they age, because those of these early elves that do go and live in the West, their beauty is enriched by an immortal lifetime's worth of wisdom and sorrow. Pretty neat. But anyway, eventually, the Valar do decide to invite the elves to come and live with them all the way in the west, in Valinor. So, once again, Orome, the Lord of the Hunt, rides all the way back to the east to deliver the news to the elves. And from amongst them, Orome chooses 3 emissaries, ambassadors, that'll go to Valinor, check out the Undying lands, and then return to tell their people all about it. And these ambassadors are quite important. In fact, one of them will kind of become our first major character. But they are all chosen from one of those original 3 clans. So, from the Minya, there is Ingwe. Of the Tatia, there is Finwë, and of the Nelia, there is Elwë. And all 3 of them are taken to Valinor. Now, they are taken to the Valar's city of Valmar, the city of many bells, and they even speak to Manwë and Varda themselves. Now, in episode 2, I talked about the 2 trees of Valinor, the source of all light in Arda. And I believe I mentioned back then that the light of these trees is incredibly powerful, and anyone who looks upon this light will be enriched and literally made better by the Ainua's power. Now, all three of these ambassadors behold the light of Valinor, and all three of them become the first High Elves, or Calaquendi, which simply refers to any elf who has seen the light of the trees. Now, the opposite of Calaquendi is Moraquendi, and that just means dark elves, or simply elves that never have beheld the light of Valinor. But anyway, all three of the ambassadors are so overwhelmed by the beauty and splendor of this realm that they overcome all fear and they desire to dwell within the light of the trees forever. So, for the Valar, this is great news, and they send Ingwe, Finwë, and Elwë back to Cuirvianen to spread the word among the rest of the elves. But this now begins quite a complicated process called the Sundering of the Elves, because not all of the elves agree with their ambassadors. So the first sundering, or simply breaking, of the elven kindreds begins with those who choose to heed the summons of the Valar, and those who choose to remain in darkness. So the majority of the elves do at least begin the journey west, and they leave Cuirvianen and follow Orome. And Orome calls these elves the Eldar, which literally means the Star People. Now, every single elven character that you have ever heard of in Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, all of them are descended from one of these Eldar. But there are a few who choose to remain forever in Cuirvianen, and they are remembered as the Avari, which means the unwilling. And although the Avari do pretty much pass out of the whole story at this point, it's cool to think that throughout all of Middle-earth's history, the Second Age, the Third Age, by the time we get to the Lord of the Rings, there is still a long-forgotten place in the Uttermost East called Cuirvianen, and there will always be primitive, native Avari elves just living a simple life there, next to the waters of their awakening. I just think that's a nice detail. But Tolkien's tale is the Legendarium, and that follows the story of the Eldar, the elves that do make the journey, or at least begin it. And so the Eldar begin their great migration west, under the stars, and they journey across all of Middle-earth. It's a really, really long way. It takes them, hundreds of years. But there is another nice little detail here that comes full circle in The Lord of the Rings. Because although, as we all know, elves are immortal and they can't starve to death, they do still need food, and Middle-earth is still just a dark war zone, so there's not enough plants or fruit or animals to sustain them on their journey. So, Yavanna, remember she is the Lady of Nature, she gives Orome a gift to give to the elves. And this gift is a type of blessed magical corn that Yavanna uses to make the first lembas. Now, I'm sure most of you will know that lembas is the bread of the elves, which Galadriel will give to the Fellowship when they leave Lothlorien. But what's cool about this is that because lembas is given by Yavanna, throughout all of elven culture, there's a tradition that only a woman can make lembas, and only a queen can give it as a gift. Now, technically, Galadriel is not a queen in Lord of the Rings, but she is the Lady of Lothlorien, and she is actually taught this art of making lembas from the most powerful queen ever to rule in Middle-earth. Now, we haven't met this queen yet, and I don't want to unduly spoil anything, but this is just an extra detail about elven culture, and it makes us realise just how significant it is that Galadriel gives this gift to the Fellowship, to be consumed by hobbits and men and dwarves. Also, just one more tiny side note. I know I said Yavanna gave them magical corn, but I feel like in the 21st century, when we hear corn, we imagine this, right? Like corn on the cob, maize, especially if you're American. But in British English, corn really just refers to wheat and oats and barley, things like that. And I am 99% sure that this is what Tolkien meant instead of, sweet corn. But anyway, that was a massive tangent from the Sundering of the Elves, wasn't it? Back to the Great Journey. The most eager of the 3 elven groups, and by far the smallest, are the clan that used to be known as the Vanyar. However, now they follow their High King, the Ambassador Ingwe. And for the rest of their history, they call themselves the Vanyar. And the Vanyar are known for their golden hair, and for being the fairest of all the elves. Seriously, these guys are just so perfect and golden, it's insane. They're also kind of obsessed with the Valar, especially Manwë and Varda, and so they don't even hesitate to go on the journey. They tarry in Middle-earth the least, and they are the first to reach Valinor. And it's nice, you know, because these guys really are just all about Eru Ilúvatar and the Ainur, and they just want to hang out as close to them as possible. So, as I've said, the High King of the Vanyar is Ingwe, and as well as being the High King of the Vanyar, he's also described as being the High King of all elves. But I've got to be honest, he doesn't really do that much else in the story. He's just pretty much perfect, and he never really does anything wrong or anything noteworthy. In fact, there's not really much more to say about him, or any of the Vanyar, because they just spend their entire immortal lives living peacefully with gods in the bliss of Valinor. Like, they might not be the most interesting, but if you could be any character, surely you'd want to be one of those guys, right? But the second clan of elves are a lot more memorable. They are the descendants of the Tatyr, although they now go by the Noldor. And I reckon you guys have heard of the Noldor. Some of the elves in Rivendell are Noldor. And these guys are the wisest and mightiest of all elves in both knowledge and skill. And their High King is the former ambassador Finwë, and he too leads his people to Valinor, where they live for a while in bliss. Now, the Noldor are really important, alright, so definitely remember these guys. They're going to be key players for a good deal of the coming story, and Finwë is going to be very important too. Remember the name, lodge that in your brain. But the third and final Eldar clan are the descendants of the Neliar, who are known now as the Teleri. And the Teleri are the largest of all 3 clans, although they're also considered the least mighty of the 3. And just to add another wrinkle into the story, the Teleri themselves also sunder into a few more different groups. So, although all of the Teleri are Eldar, because they all begin the journey, not all of them complete it. In fact, an awful lot of them don't. And these are those Morroquendi, those dark elves that I was talking about earlier, the ones who never make it to the light of Valinor. You see, as the Teleri journey west across Middle-earth, some of them stopped at the Misty Mountains. For Tolkien tells us that the Misty Mountains were taller and more terrible back then. And this is actually because the Misty Mountains aren't like any other mountain range in Middle-earth. They're actually considerably newer. Because if you remember from the first episode, the other mountain ranges, like the Blue Mountains or the Grey Mountains, were raised during the First War of Arda, when the planet was being formed by Manwë, Ulmo, and Aule, who were simultaneously at war with Melkor. But the Misty Mountains were raised much more recently, in the war for the sake of the elves. And they were actually raised by Melkor to basically be a kind of giant barrier, which he hoped would prevent the Valar from the west, and especially Orome, from riding through Middle-earth and reaching him in the east. So there you go, there's a fun fact about the formation of the Misty Mountains, where the dwarves will of course one day build Khazad-dûm, and Gandalf will eventually kill the last Balrog. But for that pretty understandable reason, some of the Teleri feared to climb over the mountains. So instead, they simply remained in the forests and greenlands beside the Anduin River. And they became known as the Nandor. And so the Nandor never make it to Valinor, which means they never see the light of Valinor. And as Tolkien puts it, this makes them less wise but more dangerous. Now, unlike the Avari, the Nandor we do see again, because they come to occupy the green forests that lie directly east of the Misty Mountains. And one day, these forests will become known as the forests of Mirkwood and Lothlorien. And so, the descendants of these Nandor will one day go on to be the Wood Elves that we see in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. And so, someone like Haldir, this guy, his early ancestors would have been the Nandor, this first branch of the Teleri to break away. But anyway, most of the Teleri do keep going, at least a little way further. And they do cross the Misty Mountains, and they enter an area of northwestern Middle-earth called Beleriand. But there is another huge group of Teleri that never do make it to the sea. So, as you'll remember, the High King of the Teleri is Elwë, and he is a great friend of the Noldor's High King, Finwë. And for most of their journey, Elwë and Finwë travel together. But just before they get to the shores of Beleriand, Elwë disappears. You see, he comes to a huge and ancient forest called Nan Elmoth, and something very mysterious happens here. Elwë is drawn inside this forest by the sound of nightingales, and he becomes enchanted, and Elwë actually forgets all about his people and his purpose, and he follows the sound of birds deep into the woods, until he is lost entirely. Now, Finwë and his Noldor do wait a very long time for their friend Elwë, but I gotta tell you, Finwë will never see him again. And that's because the Noldor wait so long that they realize if they don't eventually move on, they'll never get to Valinor. Now, I know I said I didn't want to spoil anything, but this mysterious power that enchants Elwë comes from the same powerful queen of Middle-earth that I mentioned a few minutes ago with the Lembas. But anyway, this leaves the rest of the Teleri in a bit of a weird position, because they are now without a High King. So some of them, many of them, decide they simply can't continue without Elwë. And they decide to make their home where they are, and they remain around the forests and rivers and on the shores of Beleriand for thousands of years, awaiting the return of their king. But understandably, there are some Teleri who are super psyched to go see the light of Valinor, and so they eventually follow Elwë's brother, who is called Olwë. And Olwë becomes the new High King of the Teleri, and he finally leads his people to an island off the coast of Beleriand called Tol Eressëa. And this island is actually ferried across the sea. It's moved by the Valar Ulmo. And the elves just kind of ride on it. They ride on this island almost like a ship, all the way across the sea to Valinor. Now, before we move on, you might be thinking this whole Elwë thing is a little bit weird, and at this point it is. But I promise you this, we will definitely see Elwë again, although it won't be for a very long time. And that's because this is where we leave Middle-earth for, as I say, thousands and thousands of years. Because now our elves, or main elves, are in Valinor, and everything is finally great. The elves bask in the light of the trees, Laurelin and Telperion, and they become great and wise and rich, and they live in harmony with the Valar. And so for 3 ages, everything is peaceful and groovy in the Blessed Realm. Now, during this time of peace and love, Finwë, the High King of the Noldor, gets married to an elf maiden called Miriel, and they live together happily in their capital city of Tirion, the city of the Noldor, which sits upon a green hill called Tuna. Now, it'll probably come as no surprise that the Vanyar choose to live with the Valar in their city of Valmar. Oh, that's hard to say. But you guys remember Olwë and the Teleri? Well, he and his people become a little bit enamored with the sea. and they become known as the Falmari, which means the Sea Elves. And they actually love the sea so much that they build themselves a port city right on the coast called Alqualonde, which becomes a haven of song and wonder and the true definition of elven bliss. Seriously, everything is perfect in paradise. Everything could not be better. Until the Third Age is up. Because, don't forget, deep, deep in the halls of Mandos, Melkor has not forgotten his defeat, nor the elves for whose sake he has been imprisoned. In his isolation and captivity, Melkor has grown ever more hateful, and he swears revenge upon his enemies. And he has had a long time to plan it. 3 long ages, in fact. And unfortunately, for everyone, these ages of bliss do eventually have to run out. Because the time will eventually come for Melkor to be set free. And friends, that, I'm afraid, is where I'm going to have to leave it, because that is pretty much the full story of the beginning of days. And after this, Tolkien's story only gets more crazy and more awesome. And I am super excited for all of us to explore that story together. But for now, if you've liked this video, be sure to give it a like and a comment with your thoughts or questions or anything else. And of course, make sure you hit the subscribe button to make sure you don't miss the next video. Now, thank you all very much for watching, and as a little treat, here is another little Tolkien fun fact. So, for the 4th and final fun fact in our Beginning of Days series, I have a lovely little fact about Professor Tolkien himself. So, by 1938, Tolkien's The Hobbit was a roaring success, and Tolkien got a letter from his friend and publisher, Stanley Unwin, basically saying, "Good news, I've just worked out a deal with a publishing house in Berlin, and we're going to get The Hobbit translated into German." Now, as I'm sure every single one of you knows, in the 1930s, Germany went through a bit of an aggressive rebranding, shall we say? And before the German translators at Rützen and Löning would translate Tolkien's The Hobbit, they first asked him to prove that he was of Aryan descent and didn't possess any Jewish heritage. Now, Tolkien did not appreciate this, and he wrote a wonderfully sassy letter in response. Actually, he wrote 2, because he didn't want to destroy Stanley Unwin's career, and the first letter just kind of ignores the question, but the second one tells off the Nazi publishers in the most Tolkien way possible. Because the thing that he attacks is their use of language. So I'm actually going to read you a few excerpts from this letter to the Nazis. Now firstly, Tolkien tells Stanley Unwin that even though he is actually the right race for the Nazis, I mean Tolkien is a German name, he said he was inclined to let a German translation go hang, as he would regret giving any colour to the notion of the wholly pernicious and unscientific race doctrine. So that's what Tolkien sent to his friend, but what he sent to the Nazis is this. "Thank you for your letter. I regret that I am not clear as to what you intend by Irish," which is just a German word for Aryan, the master race. So Tolkien said, "I am not of Aryan extraction, that is Indo-Iranian. And as far as I'm aware, none of my ancestors spoke Hindustani, Persian, Gypsy, or any related dialects." Now, of course, the Gypsies were one of the big groups that the Nazis murdered in huge numbers in the Holocaust, and I really enjoy that Tolkien basically educates them and says, well, the Gypsy language is one of these Aryan languages, you ignorant mother... Oh, I'm trying really hard not to swear on this channel. Never mind. But then Tolkien goes on to say, "But if I am to understand that you are inquiring whether I am of Jewish origin, I can only reply that I regret that I appear to have no ancestors of that gifted people." Tolkien then writes that although he was always proud of his German name, "I cannot, however, forbear to comment that if impertinent and irrelevant inquiries of this sort are to become the rule in matters of literature, then the time is not far distant when a German name will no longer be a source of pride." I trust you will find this reply satisfactory. Yours faithfully, J.R.R. Tolkien. Isn't that amazing? Like, a Nazi asked Tolkien if he was an Aryan, and Tolkien's response was, "You don't even know what that word means." Trust me, I'm Tolkien. I know a thing or two about words. Now, as it goes, The Hobbit never was translated into German until 1957, almost 20 years later. Anyway, just one more little cherry on top of this sweet fun fact. In another letter that Tolkien wrote to his son, Michael, he referred to Hitler as that ruddy little ignoramus. It seems that Tolkien had absolutely zero time for anti-Semitism and bigotry. I like that. But anyway, thank you all for watching, and until next time, much love, stay groovy, and Navaya Melanin.